The judge didn't look at me when she read it. She looked at him, and that was when I knew it was over. Not the way I'd imagined it for 8 years. Not with shouting. Not with me finally getting to say everything I'd held back since the day he left his key on the kitchen counter and walked out while I was still learning how to button my own shirt. It ended quietly, with 4 sentences from a medical file, and the sound of my ex-husband exhaling like something had just collapsed inside him. I want to tell you the whole story, because I think you deserve to know what it actually looks like. The real version, not the one where the strong woman just smiles through it and comes out fine on the other side. The version where some nights you cry in the bathroom so your kid doesn't hear you. Where you eat cereal for dinner because cooking takes 2 hands and one of yours still isn't working right. Where you wonder, genuinely and seriously, whether you made a mistake surviving. I'm going to tell you that version. My name is Anna. I was 31 years old when my life changed, and 39 when I walked into that courthouse. In between those 2 numbers is everything. I met my husband Greg at a fundraiser for the children's hospital where I worked as an occupational therapist. He was charming in the specific way that takes a while to see through. Attentive. Funny. The kind of man who remembers what you ordered the first time you had dinner together and brings it up 6 months later like it's a love language. I thought it was. I thought a lot of things. We got married when I was 28. Our daughter Nora was born 14 months later, perfect and furious and hungry every 2 hours. I took my maternity leave, went back to work part-time, and we were building something. That's the word I kept using. Building. Like if I said it enough, it would feel solid. When Nora was 3, I was driving home from an early shift on a Tuesday morning in February. The roads were clear. I remember that because afterward, people kept asking about the ice. And I kept telling them, no, the roads were clear. The other driver ran a red light. I didn't see him coming. The impact was on my side, driver's door, and the car spun twice before it stopped against a guardrail. I remember the sound. I remember not being able to feel my left arm. I remember thinking about Nora. I don't remember the ambulance. What I woke up to, 3 days later, was a ceiling I didn't recognize and the information that I had a traumatic brain injury, a fractured C6 vertebra, a shattered left shoulder, and nerve damage down my left side that the doctors described as significant and unpredictable in terms of recovery trajectory, which is medical language for, we don't know if you'll get it back. Greg was there when I woke up. He held my hand, he cried, he told me everything was going to be okay. He meant it, I think. He just didn't mean it for very long. The first month was survival. The second month was grief. By the third month I started to understand what the next year was going to look like, and so did Greg. Nora was 3 years old. She needed her mother. I needed physical therapy 3 days a week, occupational therapy twice a week, which was strange. Being on that side of it, letting someone else move my fingers through exercises I used to lead, and speech therapy for the cognitive effects of the TBI. I got headaches that lasted for days. I lost words mid-sentence. I would reach for something and my left hand would just not respond, like a phone that stopped connecting to the network. Greg worked in commercial real estate. His hours were long before the accident. After they got longer. I understood that at first. We needed the income. My disability payments had kicked in, but they didn't cover everything, so I understood. What I didn't understand was the distance. He stopped sitting with me during the evening therapy exercises. He stopped asking how the appointments went. He started sleeping in the guest room because he said I was restless and he needed his sleep for work. Which was true. I was restless, the pain did that. But there are ways to handle a restless spouse, and moving to another room is one of the more pointed ones. By month 5, he'd stopped coming home for dinner most nights. I asked him about it in October, 7 months after the accident. Nora was asleep. I had gotten better at asking direct questions by then, partly because the TBI had stripped away some of my old habit of softening everything to keep the peace. He said he didn't know how to do this. I said, do what? He said this. He gestured at me, at the brace on my shoulder, at the pill organizer on the counter, at whatever picture of our life he had in his head that no longer matched what was in front of him. I didn't say anything, because I was learning to speak again, not literally by that point but emotionally. I was learning to say the real thing and wait for the real answer, and the real answer was already in his face. He left in November. Nora had just turned 4. He packed 2 bags, said he needed space to figure things out, and told me he'd be in touch about arrangements for Nora. He left his key on the kitchen counter. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left. My left hand was resting on the counter and I couldn't feel the cold of the granite. Nora was watching something in the living room, the volume too loud, and I just stood there with my useless hand on the cold counter thinking, okay, what now? What now was everything. My younger sister Beverly, she goes by Bev, drove up from Columbus the week Greg left and stayed for 3 weeks. She slept on the couch, took Nora to preschool, made actual food, and did not once say anything that could be interpreted as "I told you so," even though she absolutely had told me so, twice, in the early years of my marriage, in her careful way that I hadn't listened to. Bev was the one who found me the outpatient program that would change the next year of my life. A rehabilitation center about 40 minutes from our house that specialized in neurological recovery. Not just physical, but cognitive, occupational, the whole picture. She drove me to the intake appointment. She sat in the waiting room for 2 hours with Nora in her lap reading the same board book 12 times. The head of my rehab team was a woman named Dr. Okafor. She was matter-of-fact in a way I needed badly by then. Not cold but not soft either. She laid out what we were working with, what the realistic goals were, and what the timeline might look like if I did the work. The nerve damage is real, she told me. But the brain is plastic. That's not a metaphor. It literally rewires. What we're doing here is helping it find new routes. I thought about that a lot, new routes. The first time I successfully buttoned a shirt with my left hand, I cried for 10 minutes. Not from happiness exactly. From something more complicated, grief for how long it took, pride that I did it, anger that I had to relearn something I'd done 1,000 times without thinking. All of it at once. Nora was 4.5 by then. She used to sit on the bathroom counter, while I got ready in the morning, kicking her feet against the cabinet, narrating her own thoughts the way we're 4-year-olds do. Rambling about her friends at preschool, about the caterpillar she'd seen in the backyard, about what she wanted to be when she grew up, which changed every week. That March it was a veterinarian. In April it was a chef. In May she announced she wanted to be someone who helps people, which made me have to turn away from the mirror. Greg called every few weeks. Sometimes he came and took Nora for a Saturday. He was not cruel about it. He didn't cancel often. He showed up when he said he would. He brought her home on time. But he was also not present. There is a version of absence that wears the mask of reliability, and that's what it was. He performed the minimum. He never asked how I was doing. He never asked about the rehab. He met someone else, a woman named Camille, I found out through a mutual friend, within 6 months of leaving. Our divorce finalized when Nora was 5. I got the house, primary custody, child support. Greg got alternating weekends and a schedule of holidays that he followed about 60% of the time. I built our life out of what was left. It took me 2 full years to get back to work. Not 2 years of doing nothing, 2 years of PT and OT and cognitive rehab and pushing through the headaches and the days when my brain simply would not cooperate, and I'd sit at the kitchen table trying to write a grocery list and forget what I'd already written. 2 years of learning new routes, like Dr. Okafor said. I went back part-time first. The hospital was accommodating. I'd been there for 6 years before the accident, and they wanted me back. I started with 2 days a week doing assessments, no hands-on treatment while my left arm was still inconsistent. By the end of that year, I was back to 4 days. By the end of the following year, I was full-time and running a small group program for pediatric patients, which became the best part of my week every week. Nora was 7 when I went back full-time. She had started 2nd grade and had a teacher she loved, a best friend named Poppy who came over every Friday, and a habit of leaving her shoes directly in the middle of the front hallway no matter how many times I mentioned it. She was funny and opinionated and fiercely kind in the way some children are, the ones who seem to have been born already knowing what matters. She talked about Greg sometimes, not with anger. She was too young for that, and I was careful about what I said. She'd ask why Daddy didn't come to her school play, and I'd say Daddy was busy, and we'd do something special to celebrate another time, and she'd accept that with the pragmatism of a child who has already learned that some adults are unreliable. I don't know when exactly she stopped expecting him at things. I noticed the absence of her mentioning it more than I noticed any particular moment. One day she just stopped saving him a seat. Greg's visits had tapered off. From alternating weekends to once a month too, by the time Nora was 8, something more like 6 or 7 times a year. He'd moved to Phoenix with Camille. He called on Nora's birthday and at Christmas and sometimes in between. Nora was polite on the phone and quiet afterward. I didn't push it, I didn't block it either. I let her feel whatever she felt without telling her what to feel about it, which was harder than it sounds, and is possibly the thing I'm most proud of from those years. I made things work. We had what we needed, not everything we might have wanted, but what we needed. I had my sister Bev, who drove up once a month and always stayed too short. I had my colleague and friend Patrick, who covered for me when Nora was sick and brought coffee to my office, when he could tell it was a hard day and never made a production of any of it. I had the pediatric group program on Wednesdays that reminded me every week what I was good at and why it mattered. I had Nora, who was growing into someone I genuinely admired. She was 11 when she won the regional science fair. The project was on neuroplasticity. She'd chosen it herself, she told me, because of what had happened to me. She'd interviewed Dr. Okafor over video call for 45 minutes with a list of questions she wrote herself, and she presented her findings with the particular serious focus of a child who has been thinking about something for a long time. She won first place. She gave a short speech and thanked her mom, which was when I started crying and had to pretend I had allergies. I posted a photo of her with the ribbon on my social media. Proud caption, nothing dramatic. The kind of thing parents post. Greg called 2 days later, not to congratulate Nora, or not only. He asked about the program she'd be eligible for after the science fair win, the regional STEM pathway that could lead to opportunities through the school district. He'd been reading about it, he said. Something tightened in my chest that I hadn't felt in a while. I said yes, she's excited about it. He said he'd been thinking a lot about Nora, about the future, about being more involved. I said, that's great, the schedule is always open to adjustments. He said, actually, what he was thinking was something more formal, something more stable for her. He was back in Ohio now. He and Camille had moved back 6 months ago, I hadn't known. And he wanted to talk about a more serious arrangement. I said, what kind of arrangement? He said he'd been talking to a lawyer. I sat with that phone call for 3 days before I told Bev. She was quiet for a long moment when I told her, which meant she was deciding between the kind thing and the honest thing. She went with honest. He saw the photo, she said. He saw who she's becoming, and now he wants credit. I didn't sleep well that month. Not the way I hadn't slept in the early rehab years, from pain. This was different. This was the specific sleeplessness of someone trying to hold something together with both hands and feeling it strain anyway. His attorney sent a formal motion 8 weeks later. Greg was petitioning for primary physical custody of Nora, who was now 11. His grounds: that he had stabilized his life, that he was now living locally, that Nora was at a critical developmental stage and would benefit from more time with her father, and that my work schedule and medical history made primary custody less than ideal for her long-term well-being. My medical history. I read that phrase 4 times. I found my attorney through a referral from the hospital's legal department. A woman named Adrienne who had been doing family law for 22 years, and whose first question to me was not about the case but about Nora. What does Nora want? She asked. I told her Nora hadn't been told yet, and that I intended to tell her honestly and age-appropriately and let her say what she felt. Adrienne nodded. Good, she said, because the court may want to hear from her directly. I told Nora that weekend. We sat on the back porch with lemonade, which felt like a thing you do when you're about to say something hard. Surround it with ordinary life. I told her that her dad had asked a judge to let her live with him more of the time, and that a judge was going to think carefully about what was best for her, and that the most important thing was that Nora knew she could say exactly what she wanted, and nobody would be in trouble. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, does he actually want me there, or does he just want to be the dad of someone who won the science fair? I didn't answer that. It wasn't my answer to give. She said, I want to talk to the judge. I said, okay. The process took 4 months. I won't walk through every meeting, every document request, every evening I spent at the kitchen table, going through files while Nora did homework at the other end. I'll tell you the parts that mattered. The guardian ad litem, the attorney appointed to represent Nora's interests, met with her 3 times. I was not in the room. I had no idea what Nora said. I told myself that was how it was supposed to work, and I tried to believe it. Greg's attorney submitted documentation of his current income, his residence, his character references. He had good ones, old friends, a neighbor, someone from his professional network. He presented as stable. He was stable, in the narrow factual sense. He had a house and a job and had not been in legal trouble, and had technically maintained contact with his daughter throughout her life. Our attorney submitted documentation of everything else. 8 years of school records, teacher letters, medical records from my recovery, organized carefully with Dr. Okafor's current assessment of my functional status, which was full recovery of gross motor function, residual left side weakness under high fatigue, cognitively compensated and professionally active, not the woman he'd left. Or rather, still that woman, but 8 years further. She submitted my employment file from the hospital, my performance reviews, the pediatric group program's outcomes data, a letter from the hospital's chief of rehabilitation services that I had not asked for and cried when I read. She submitted the visitation log I had kept since the divorce. Every visit, every cancellation, every time Greg was supposed to come and didn't. I had kept it in a plain spiral notebook, 1 line per entry, dates and notes. I'd started it because a friend who'd been through a divorce told me to write everything down. I'd kept it because it was true, and I figured the truth should exist somewhere. 43 visits in 8 years, against a court order that allowed for significantly more. I also submitted Nora's request to speak to the judge, which was approved. The morning of the hearing I woke up at 5 and lay in the dark for an hour, not praying, not planning, just existing. Letting the fear be there without trying to talk it down. At 6 I got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, and thought about all the mornings I'd sat in exactly this spot and gotten through whatever the day was. I thought about the morning after Greg left, with my hand on the cold granite. I thought about the morning I drove myself to PT, for the first time. Just getting in the car alone, shifting with my right hand because I still couldn't trust my left to respond reliably. Telling myself this was possible. I thought about the morning Nora had woken up early and climbed into my bed and said, "Out of nowhere, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met, Mom." I'd asked her why. She'd said because you never stop. She was 7. I hadn't told her anything that would have led her to say that. She'd just been watching. Nora came downstairs at 7. She was wearing her good jeans and a blue sweater she'd picked herself. She poured herself cereal, sat down across from me, and looked at me very seriously. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said. "You?" "Yeah," she said. "I know what I want to say." I believed her. The courthouse was smaller than I'd imagined from all the time I'd spent thinking about it. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the specific quiet of a room where difficult things get decided. Greg was already there with his attorney when we arrived. He looked good. He always looked good. That had never been the issue. We nodded at each other the way people do when they have a long history and a short vocabulary for it now. The hearing was not dramatic in the way I'd feared. No shouting, no revelations from the gallery. What it was careful. Both attorneys presented their cases. Documents were submitted. The guardian ad litem gave her report, which I was hearing for the first time along with everyone else. She had interviewed Nora 3 times, she said. She had spoken with Nora's teachers, her pediatrician, my sister, a family friend. Her recommendation was that primary physical custody remain with me. Then Nora spoke. She sat in the chair that had been arranged for her. They'd done it thoughtfully, at a slight angle, so she wasn't looking directly at Greg or directly at me but at the judge. And she was composed in a way that made my throat close. She said she loved her dad. She said that clearly, without hedging. She said she knew he was trying to be more present and she appreciated that. She said she also wanted to be honest. She said she had lived with her mom her whole life. She said she'd watched her mom go to PT before school and work, and make dinner and help with homework and show up to every single thing. She said she remembered being 6 years old and helping her mom practice opening jars, because her left hand wasn't strong enough yet, and her mom had said we can make this a game, and so they made it a game. She said those were some of her best memories from that time. She said she didn't want to live primarily with someone she'd seen 43 times in 8 years. She knew the number. I hadn't told her. She'd found the notebook. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the judge said, "Thank you, Nora." And Nora walked back to her seat with the same composure she'd walked in with, and sat down next to the guardian ad litem and folded her hands in her lap. Greg's attorney made a brief closing argument. Mine made hers. Then there was a recess, and then we reconvened, and the judge began to speak. She talked about continuity of care. She talked about the established relationship between a child and her primary parent. She talked about the documentation of my recovery and current functioning, and she was specific and clear and did not treat my medical history as a liability in the way Greg's attorney had framed it. Then she opened the medical file. She read 4 sentences from Dr. Okafor's assessment, The clinical summary of my recovery, 8 years of records compressed into a short paragraph that described what I had been, what I had done, and where I was now. She didn't look at me when she read it. She looked at Greg. I watched him. I'd been watching him for years across different kinds of distances, and I knew his face. I saw something change in it. Not collapse. He was too controlled for that in a public setting. But something settled, or maybe something let go, in the way that happens when a person stops fighting a thing they already knew was true. The judge set down the file. Primary physical custody, she said, would remain with me. Greg would have expanded visitation rights. More than he'd been exercising, structured and enforceable, with a clear schedule. If he wanted to be more present, there was a path for that. The court would not reward 8 years of absence with a custody transfer, but it would not close the door on a father who was genuinely ready to show up. She said this plainly, not harshly, just as the truth of what the evidence showed. Outside the courthouse, Greg and I stood on the steps for a moment before his attorney guided him toward the parking garage. He looked at me and there was something in his face I hadn't expected. "She's incredible," he said. I said, "Yeah, she is." He said, "You did that." I didn't say anything to that. Not because I disagreed, but because I was done explaining myself to him. There wasn't anything left to explain. Nora had said it herself in her own words, in front of a judge. That was enough. Bev was waiting with Nora by the car. Nora had her hands in her sweatshirt pocket and was looking at her shoes. When she saw me, she looked up. I walked to her. We stood there. "You were incredible in there," I said. She shrugged with one shoulder, which is her version of thank you. "You taught me that," she said. "Taught you what?" "To say the real thing." I pulled her into a hug and held on. Bev made a noise that wasn't quite crying, and then definitely was. We stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse on a gray October morning, and I held my daughter and thought about the woman I'd been 8 years ago, standing in her kitchen with her hand on cold granite, thinking, what now? I thought about the new roots, all those new roots laid down one by one over years, all of them leading here, to this sidewalk, to this kid. That's the real version. The one where you fall apart and put yourself back together and fall apart again, and build a life out of everything that's left and raise a person who is somehow, improbably, braver than you are. I didn't need anyone to hand me a ribbon. The evidence spoke for itself. It always does, eventually.